Order. Order. And can we welcome you, Cabinet Secretary, to our last session in our Intergovernmental Relations Inquiry. So we're really grateful for you to come down here in person this morning to join us. Just for the record, who you are, your role in government, and anything by way of a short introductory statement. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you. I have no real introductory statement. I look forward to answering your questions. My apologies for being unable to make the original scheduled date last week owing to a debate in the Scottish Parliament. I'm Michael Russell. I'm a member of Scottish Parliament for Argyll and Bute, and I'm the Cabinet Secretary for Government, Business and Constitutional Relations. I was previously Minister for UK Negotiations and Scotland's Place in Europe, which is I have a continuity role in that regard. And, of course, I have been a member of the Scottish Government on and off for the last 12 years in various portfolios.
Grateful for that. As I said, this is our last session, and we've heard quite a number of compelling evidence about the intergovernmental relations. Just in your view, how would you currently assess the relationship that the Scottish Government have with UK Government just now?
I think it is poor at governmental level, and I think at official level, I think it has been better. My own view is that whatever your position on constitution or anything else, there requires to be a functioning relationship. And the problem is that the weight of Brexit has been too heavy for what was a pretty inadequate architecture, in any case, to bear. And you are by no means the first committee to inquire into this over a long period of time. Committees of every political hue and academics of every position have drawn broadly the same conclusions, that it doesn't really work as a structure and it requires to change. That is also a position I think that is adopted not just by ourselves, by the Welsh Labour government, and I've worked very closely with Mark Drakeford when he was in my position and now as First Minister, and working with Jeremy Miles, his successor, and that in Northern Ireland that has been the view, I think even at times of the unionist community, that it needed a more robust structure, and we are now in a position where that structure cannot bear what is taking place and will require to change. I have my preference for change. That will not be a surprise to anybody in this room. But the change needs to be focused on a relationship of equality if we are to function properly. And that is the outcome that I would seek.
I think we've heard a lot that, particularly from academics, that the success and the existing intergovernmental machinery is down to goodwill between different branches of government throughout the United Kingdom, and this has been severely tested by the Brexit process, as I think that you identified. I mean, what are the particular difficulties, issues that you would identify, and how would you seek to resolve some of the problems that we have, particularly when it comes around the issues of Brexit?
Well, I think it's quite revealing that the JMC plenary didn't meet from the end of 2014 until October 2016. And the only other part of the JMC structure that was really in operation during that time was the JMCE, and that has a narrow function, which is to bring together the devolved administrations before each European Council. But it actually became a clearinghouse eventually for all UK government departments to find out what was happening at the European Council. I've been involved in the JMC structure on and off in my ministerial career, but in 2009, when I had the Culture and External Affairs portfolio, I went to one JMCE in which there were, forgive me, I can't remember the exact number, 21 or 22 UK ministers, myself and Rodri Morgan. So it had a function sort of outside the JMC. It was a briefing space. But apart from that, the arrangement simply wasn't functioning. Suddenly, with Brexit, there was a requirement. It could have been a positive requirement to consult the devolved administrations, particularly Northern Ireland and Scotland, which had voted against leaving. But it actually became a sort of negative requirement, which was simply to get into the position that there could be an understanding of how this was going to work, if it was going to work. And that's where we've ended up.
Because there's different objectives between the Scottish Government and the UK Government when it comes to Brexit. Is that basically why it's fallen down or hasn't been as effective as you would like to see?
The need to have a different approach was shown by which was a unanimous agreement to set up the JMCEN, which was reached at the Downing Street JMC plenary in October 2016, and to agree its remit. And that was a specific written remit. You will have it on the record, but broadly it had two parts. One was to seek to agree the Article 50 letter, and the second one was to attempt to have oversight of the negotiations insofar as they affected the devolved competencies. So that the difference was recognised, but I think the objectives were different. They were agreed, they were written down, but then they weren't fulfilled. The Article 50 letter was never shown to the committee. Neither Mark Drakeford or I saw the letter until it was submitted. I mean, I saw it on the afternoon it was submitted when it was released to the press. And in terms of oversight of negotiations, that word oversight has completely disappeared from discussions. There are discussions continuing about what involvement there might be if negotiations take place. So for a while it didn't really fulfill its remit. And what it's tended now to do is to try and firefight on issues such as frameworks, which I'm sure we'll come on to, issues of relationships on key areas of dispute or difficulty, and generally to keep a contact going and a conversation going. But even that's pretty defective. I mean, last night there was no consultation or even information coming formally government to government. There was, of course, a briefing for Arlene Foster. There was no briefing for Nicola Sturgeon. And I think that does tell you quite a lot about it.
And we've seen episodes, of course, in the past few weeks and months where there's every indication of a breakdown in relationship, particularly the UK government taking the Scottish government to the Supreme Court, the withholding of legislative consent from the Scottish government. I mean, do these episodes sort of suggest to the committee that there's deep-seated problems and issues with this, or are these things manageable, and is there still some sort of form of communication?
I mean, the structure has ceased to work. We can make do and mend in a superficial way. And at the heart of this, and there's no point in dancing around this point, the heart of this, devolution has always been a set of compromises built around the notion of Westminster parliamentary sovereignty. There is no hierarchy of governments in devolution. Governments have different roles. Those are defined by Schedule 5 of the Scotland Act, what each government does, or rather what is reserved to Westminster, and everything else is for the Scottish government. But there is a hierarchy of parliaments, and that is because Westminster regards itself as sovereign. That centre cannot hold, if I can use the Yeats phrase. It is no longer relevant in these circumstances. I want an equality. I think that is best achieved by independence. But if you agreed that it wasn't working, and your objective was to find a better system, it would have to be based on a system in which the component parts respected each other, were able to work together, had equal opportunities and equal says, and had a dispute resolution mechanism. You'd have to have all those things built in, and it would have to be statutory. Now, given that the sovereignty of the Westminster Parliament runs against that, something will have to give.
Can I just add, we heard quite a lot about the Scotland office in the course of the past 2 weeks, and we had former First Ministers and Secretary of State for Scotland in front of this committee, and we were quite surprised at just some of the responses we had from them, particularly from Jack McConnell, who was the last non-SNP First Minister of Scotland, who was quite scathing of the role of the Scottish Secretary of State. I mean, what role has the Scotland office got in supporting the relationship between the UK and Scottish governments? It's
an issue that needs tackled, but the present government doesn't appear even willing to address it. But the Secretary of State for Scotland, the Office of Secretary of State for Scotland, re-established in 1886, became a cabinet post in 1926. It was established because there was a growing measure of administrative devolution. The establishment of a variety of boards, the Fisheries Board, you had the Pensions Board, then you had the wonderfully named Scotch Education Department. You had all these boards, and you had administrative devolution, and there had to be some oversight. So you had the political oversight. Now, with the best will in the world, and I'm differentiating the holder of the office from the office, that is no longer the case. There is a political structure, and and there are two governments that can work together. If there is a future for this, it has to be department in Scottish government to department in the UK government. I encourage my colleagues to develop and build the process of quadrilateral meetings, which I think is very important. But when we go to the JMCEN, it is without fear of contradiction, it is the Scottish government that speaks for Scotland. That's what we do on devolved issues. That's our responsibility. And I can't actually see, and because the JMCEN does not discuss other issues, I can't see the role of the Secretary of State for Scotland in that. And actually, I don't think there is a role. So I think that is a nettle that will have to be grasped, or a thistle that will have to be grasped, and to say times have changed. The establishment of this role was one thing, it is no longer relevant.
models that's been suggested to the committee, and was struck by Professor Jim Gallagher, who talks about a new department which could be set up for intergovernment relations. And again, Lord McConnell and Lord Wallace talking of a beefed up Department of Constitutional Affairs, headed up by a powerful Secretary of State. Would that be the type of government-to-government relationship that you would see working
that
more
exists,
effectively?
of course. I mean, what the moment is, you've got one thing that exists and another thing exists, and the second one, the presence of the Secretary of State for Scotland and his office is largely irrelevant in it. You know, David Lidington has the responsibility for devolution. You know, he chairs the JMC-EN, and that's moved on from when that started. It was chaired by David Davis, and I think it became obvious that it was better chaired by somebody who was focused on the issues of ensuring that the relationships were kept there. But there's also direct contact between ministers. So Fergus Ewing and Rosanna Cunningham will meet with Michael Gove and George Eustace, whoever's now in that role, and their Welsh counterpart on a regular basis. So that is how things have developed. You just have this other appendage hanging on, which is the Scotland office and the Welsh office, and there isn't really much point in it.
It's happened organically in the course of the past few years, isn't it, with the arrival of a powerful Deputy Prime Minister who has these responsibilities in government. And I'm just wondering, therefore, what does the Secretary of State do? We hear a lot about promoting...
Damien Green, and I pay tribute to him because I felt he got it, you know, pretty quickly, actually, what was happening. He slimmed down the JMC-EN. It had become completely unmanageable. There were ministers in every corner of the room, you know, and civil servants. He slimmed it down. He focused on that relationship, and he built... I mean, many UK ministers, and this is not a criticism, do not know much about devolution. They've not had to know much about devolution. You know, devolution was 20 years ago. It's only old stagers who hang on like myself who remember devolution in that regard. So, you know, in those circumstances, it really is clear now that that's a relationship, and Damien got the relationship, and he built that, he slipped the committee down. He kept the territorial secretaries of state, because I think it was embarrassing not to do so at the committee. But they're not key players in that. You know, the key players would be a conversation I would have with David Lidington, a conversation that Mark Drakeford or his successor would have, Stephen Barclay engaging with us in some way, the ministerial forum, which is the level below that we've established. That would be the relationship. Now, it may not work, but you know, there's no need for the Scotland office to be there.
Okay, we've got a couple of supplementaries on this. First, Tommy Shepherd, and then Christine Jard. Tommy.
Cabinet Secretary, I just ask you to clarify one thing, because I find that when people like you or I discuss the continuing role of the Secretary of State for Scotland, people are suspicious of our motivation. They think that perhaps because we advocate Scottish independence, that therefore automatically we wouldn't want any UK involvement in Scotland, and that's why we take the position. Can I just clarify that what you're saying is that within the terms of the existing devolution settlement, you feel that settlement is frustrated and compromised by the continuing pre-devolution roles which are in operation?
I think, with the greatest respect, I think frustrated and compromised might be putting it too strongly. I just think it's not relevant to what we're doing. It doesn't reckon in our thinking. And I think it is an appendage from a past settlement which isn't necessary in there. There's, of course, a difference with the Secretary of State from Northern Ireland, which needs to be recognised in terms of the structure, and that's a matter for somebody else. But in Wales and Scotland, I think that time has passed. And you know, now I want a different structure. You know, I'd much rather not have this structure. But if your aim was to have a functioning and effective structure between governments, then there would be no necessity to invent that role if it didn't exist.
Okay, and could I just ask one further thing, which is almost a non-political question? I mean, you have extensive experience of Scottish cabinet in various different roles, as you say. In your experience, what is the day-to-day function of the Secretary of State for Scotland in terms of the governance of Scotland? I mean, because there are, of course, some serious reserved matters with big UK departments which have a remit in Scotland, the DWP being an example. Does the Secretary of State provide some sort of go-between between those big reserved departments in the Scottish Government, or would you rather just deal direct with the DWP?
But we do deal direct with the DWP. That's the issue now. That's what happens. And the Secretary of State in a department that has reserved and non-reserved functions. Michael Gove's an example. He is not, if I may use the word, blate at coming to Scotland himself and having conversations with people. He doesn't need an interlocutor to do that. And I don't know many who do. Jeremy Hunt was lecturing in Glasgow University last week. It just doesn't seem to me that if the role is interlocutor between the Scottish Parliament, the Scottish Government and Westminster, there's no need for it. If the role is representing the reserved issues within Scotland, that is being done by the Secretaries of State who have areas with UK responsibility. So I just don't see what the purpose is. I mean, in terms of the day-to-day functioning of the government, I don't think that the role has any function at all.
Thank you. Christine Jarton.
Thank you very much. You touched on the end, Mr Shepherd's touched on it. There could be criticism that it suits a particular narrative not to have a Scot who is a Scottish MP, who is representative of Scotland at the Cabinet table to ensure that there is a particularly Scottish aspect, a particularly Welsh aspect and a particularly Northern Irish aspect, and that it's more difficult for those who would like to claim that Scotland doesn't have a voice in Westminster if there isn't a Secretary of State for Scotland.
Yes, I mean, that would be a claim. I would refute it, and I'd suggest that there was another model that you could follow. One that's rather interestingly just started to develop as a result, and this might be a positive thing you might take out of Brexit. Some couple of months ago, I think just after Christmas, the Prime Minister asked the First Minister to attend the new UK Cabinet subcommittee on exit. And I've been attending, John Swinney and I have been attending essentially the meetings when required. I mean, this is not a blanket invitation, but I think we've been there about 1 minute meeting out of two each time it's taken place. Now, you could postulate that building an effective system of relationships between the governments, which was based upon equity, maybe based on the issue of the Welsh have published a very good paper on this, on having a Council of Ministers of some sort, and an engagement in appropriate UK government structures would be more effective. That would represent, the Scottish Government would be represented in that way. Now, it would be for others to determine whether we have been constructive in these matters, but I do believe that we have taken part in all these meetings, and there have been many, many meetings over the last 2.5 years, in good faith. And in those circumstances, you could start to construct what I think would be a more effective.
Having worked through the Scotland office, I would say that there is still a need for an administrative or functional role to be the link between the Scottish Government ministers and the Cabinet. But one of the things which we have heard in this committee was actually, you referred to it there just now, Lord Wallace, who has experience of both the Scotland office and the Scottish Government. And he made the proposition that what we perhaps should be looking at is a Council of Ministers. And that would be a way of developing devolution and moving towards a more federal structure. What would your thoughts be on the possibility of a Council of Ministers, including a Scottish Secretary?
Yeah, I mean, we take as read that I think if you're looking to establish equality, then the best way to do that is to have independence. That's Occam's razor. The simplest solution is usually the best. But putting that to one side, the Welsh have published a very useful paper on this. They published it last year. If people haven't read it, I would commend it. Don't agree with every word of it. But it is based upon ideas that Mark Drakeford brought to the table in JMCEN and which I've endorsed often, which is to look at a new structure that would have effective councils of ministers, that would have dispute resolution, in which nobody had a veto, and everybody came to that table, representing their interests. Now, I think that would be a better system than one we have now. I'm not saying it's the best system, it would be a better system we have now. I don't see the current system as being one which allows any of that to happen.
Given that other MSPs, as well as Lord Wallace, some MSPs who are not in the government have expressed support for that type of process, do you think it would find general support in the Scottish Parliament?
Oh, I'd never predict what the Scottish Parliament was going to do, but I think it should be part of the debate, undoubtedly. I mean, I think the important thing here is if you accept that the current structures don't work, and without prejudice and political positioning, I hope most people would begin to accept that the current structures don't work. If the current structures don't work, what would replace them and what would produce a better result? Okay, let's park what I believe is the best result of all. The Scottish Parliament needs to have that discussion. The UK government needs to have that discussion, and that's a key issue in here. the JMC structure is under review at the present moment. It has been under review for the last year, I think. Nothing has come of it. Nothing at all has come of it. And that is a key issue.
We're still on questions about the Office of the Secretary of State for Scotland. I know we're getting into other territory here, so I've got 3 other supplementaries. Are they all on that issue? Is that right? Yeah. David Duckett.
It's just not on the Secretary of State for Scotland.
It's not. Okay. Jed Killen.
Thank you, Chair. Lord McConnell in his evidence suggested...
Sorry to interrupt, but I did have a supplementary on something Mr Russell said earlier.
And when there's other opportunities and the further questions to raise that.
Well, I'd like to ask.
So let's deal with the Secretary of State for Scotland. We'll come back to Mr. Jed Killen.
Thank you, Chair. Lord McConnell in his evidence suggested that you could have a Department of Constitutional Affairs or a Department of the Nations and Regions headed up by, he described it as a powerful Secretary of State, somebody like the Deputy Prime Minister. And then within that, each of the departments, the office, the Scotland Office, Welsh Office, with ministers in those positions. Do you think that that's something that you could support, or that you think would be helpful in terms of trying to keep that voice, of devolution or of nations and regions in the cabinet, but sort of recognising that it doesn't have as powerful a role as it once did?
I think it is likely to be clearer and better if there are direct relationships between, for example, myself and David Livington on issues of constitution, if there are direct relationships between Fergus Ewing and Michael Gove on issues of agriculture and fisheries. I think that's likely to be more effective. I don't see what the middleman or the middle department is going to contribute effectively. And I think that's just part of the evolution. Donald Dewar called devolution a process, not an event. I think it's part of the process of change. And I think we've got to the stage in the process where those relationships are easier to operate than one that is mediated by the Scotland Office. The Scotland Office doesn't mediate it. I mean, I think it would be a matter of some astonishment to some UK Secretaries of State if they thought that they had to, or were expected, to go through the Secretary of State for Scotland when dealing with Scottish ministers. It just doesn't happen.
Okay, thank you. Hugh Gaffney.
I think you've just answered my question. I was going to ask how often does the Secretary of State and the Scottish First Minister meet? Direct. You think you've just answered that question.
Yeah.
Do they meet direct? Like, as the Scottish Secretary of State, when it was Labour, they could pick up the phone and talk to each other. But as those calls happen regularly, I think you just maybe said it's not.
Yeah, the First Minister and the Prime Minister communicate. Right, as the Prime Minister also communicates with the Welsh First Minister and the Northern Irish First Minister. That would be expected. I honestly couldn't tell you how often they meet, because it doesn't strike me as something I've ever really thought about. What I think I do think about is when Jean Freeman has an issue on health, I don't think it would cross her mind to say I better talk to the Secretary of State for Scotland. Yeah. She thinks I'd better talk to the Health Minister about this. And actually, when you think about the way in which you can get results, it's a bit better to do it that way than to have to go through the intermediaries.
Other issues raised about... Is this on Secretary of State, Deidre, before we come to David?
It was just something on the back.
Okay, we'll come to you. Okay. David Duckett and Deidre.
Thank you, Chair. Mr Russell, it was just something you said earlier about recognising the hierarchy of the sovereignty of parliaments, but not the hierarchy of sovereignty of governments. I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit. But in your response, I wonder if you could explain to me, at least, I don't know if it's known by the rest of the committee, why the Scottish Government have ministers with responsibilities for example, international development, foreign affairs, international trade, and other reserved functions.
Well, the second one is quite easy to function. International affairs is not, as the Supreme Court judged in recently, it's not solely to do with the UK government. International relations is a reserved matter, but the implementation of international obligations and, for example, issues of trade are devolved and can be effectively managed in a devolved way. You could take a very purist position and say that the moment you became First Minister, you gave up your passport, and you only got it back when you stopped being First Minister. But that would seem strange, given Arlene Foster goes to America for St Patrick's Day and for other events, Carwyn Jones went to Doha, I seem to remember, sometime recently. So I think all the devolved administrations of whatever hue, right, recognise there is a role in international relations and in working with others. And frankly, given Brexit, my own view is that building those relationships is absolutely essential for even for the maintenance of Scottish trade and.
But does that not assume? Sorry to interrupt. But does that not assume that Scotland has a separate role to play in a post-Brexit world from the rest of the United Kingdom, which is not necessarily the case?
Well, I think that you and I would have to disagree
well, we will.
No, yes, I'm not overwhelmed by the thought of you and I disagreeing. There is a role for Scotland to play. I would much rather it played an independent role. But whatever the role is, it is a role of direct relationship with others. And interestingly, you could argue this on a purist basis, which is to say the government of Scotland should never deal with a sovereign government of another country. You could argue, I think it's wrong, but you could argue that on a purist basis. I'm not sure you could argue that in the terms of the government of Scotland shouldn't deal with Bad Württemberg, right? Which of course is a German state. You would say, well, actually, Bad Württemberg would be quite keen that would happen. I remember one of the people who asked to see me as Brexit minister was a trade minister from the Cape Province in South Africa. And he came to talk to me because he was worried about the effect of trading relationships between Scotland and the Cape Province in South Africa. Should I have sent him to the Secretary of State? I don't know. Maybe he saw the Secretary of State. But we were able to have a civilised conversation. So let me come to the first part of your question, just in terms of you were asking about the devolved settlement and.
Well, the main question at the start of my question was why you recognise a hierarchy of sovereignty of parliaments, but not as
because that is what devolution says. Devolution says that the UK Parliament can overrule the Scottish Parliament. Right? That is understood. I don't like it. I wouldn't like it, but that's true, and that's what happened with the withdrawal bill. And that is a cause of contention. I think it's not a basis on which you could have an equal relationship. But, the UK government cannot overrule the Scottish government on devolved issues. It can't do it. It can go to Parliament and say to the UK Parliament, we don't like what has happened here, we want to pass a resolution here. But the governments have clear functions. The reserved functions are laid out in Schedule 5, and of course, as in all things, there will be interpretation of those. And then what is not reserved is operated by the Scottish Government. So that seems clear to me.
So on the trade aspect, I can totally appreciate and understand the need for Scottish businesses to have a link with either their customers or their supply chains in other parts of the world, not just in the EU, but everywhere. And that was something that I agreed with, and I came to that agreement with your... you may remember the official title now, that I think the Scottish Affairs Councillor in the British Embassy in the US, colloquially known as the American Ambassador to Scotland, or the Scottish Ambassador to America. And we came to that agreement that the relationship is from business to business rather than from nation to nation. But it's often reported as such as this is Scotland talking to another country rather than somebody representing Scottish businesses. But putting that aside, but
the one, just respond to that point, because I could give you, I'd have to dredge my memory, but on the occasions that I have been a minister in any role travelling abroad, when you go travelling abroad on behalf of the government, you take on roles in all departments because you're taking advantage of things. I can think of many occasions in which I have sat down with businesses in other countries and explained to them how things operate in Scotland, explained to them what opportunities might exist. Ivan McKee, for example, has I talked to him some weeks ago about a trip he'd made, I think, to Hamburg and also a trip to Poland. And in both places they were talking about supply chains for renewables. That seems an entirely fair and useful thing to do. So I don't think it's a matter of representing, we are Scotland. It is saying, here's a good facilitation that we can put in place. And we have done.
So you'll remember, Cabinet Secretary, this is an innovation for the Scottish National Party government, because you'll recall, as I will, the Labour and Liberal Malawi initiative, which set up a particular fund, which I have schools in my constituency are twinned with schools in Malawi. It's a thoroughly good thing, surely, to have these types of international outreach programmes. I
have had the honour of co-chairing the Joint Commission between Malawi and Scotland on a visit to Malawi in, I think, 2012, 2013. And that was a Jackson initiative. It was a very important initiative, and it took place. But there are relationships to be had. They are good relationships. When you look at trade, you can look at the paper that we published on trade and also say things change. Brexit changes things. And therefore we should continue to change.
Yep. Anyway, we're very early on in the questions that we've got here. We've got Deidre Brock and then we'll move on after that. Deidre.
It's actually on the back of that because, as far as I'm aware, Northern Ireland has international trade devolved to it. Are you aware of any particular problems once, clearly the Assembly hasn't sat for some time, but problems the UK government had with that relationship?
I'm not aware of them. I mean, the Welsh Government has officials in Dublin as we have officials in Dublin. They have officials in Brussels and we have officials in Brussels. These appear to be perfectly reasonable things to do. I mean, you could take a step further. You could do what Belgium has done with its devolved governments, which is to give them legal personality, and then they would be able to enter into direct trading links and relationships and treaties on areas of devolved competence. That would seem to me not far enough, but seem to be a useful step.
John Lamont.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Just to follow up on that point, I mean, it's important to recognise that the Smith Commission looked at all these things after the referendum in 2014, which had SNP representatives on it, and you signed up to the revisions to the devolution settlement, which has now been implemented. So all these other things are now add-ons beyond what you signed up to back in 2014-15.
There were many things which we wished to see, which the Smith Commission did not agree to. This was a process of negotiation. You don't get everything you want in negotiation. But I would argue, Mr. Lamont, that Brexit has changed everything. Brexit is the most extraordinary event that I've seen in my political career, and I think that it is entirely legitimate, not just for us. The Welsh Labour government have done the same too, in a country that voted narrowly, admittedly, but voted for Brexit, to reassess where things are. And I think that is now where we are. Now, there's nothing new about that. Equally nothing new, as you will be aware as a former member of the Scottish Parliament, that I espoused independence to have an equal relationship. But I also think, looking at Brexit in the close way I have seen it, it puts into sharp relief what doesn't work, and that's important to talk about that.
Yeah, and the voters have rejected your proposals in the past. I want to move on to the development of the common frameworks, and just to get a sense from where you think the Scottish Government has got to in terms of the development of the common frameworks.
Yes, I think the frameworks is a rare example of something that we have been able to, with firmness and determination, and with the Welsh Government working closely with them, get ourselves at least to, I suppose, a equilibrium. There have been two periodic reports now, which of course are reports shared by the UK Government and the devolved administrations, on the work that's being done on frameworks. Both of those have concluded that there is no need to move forward with a Section 12 order in any area, and that is extremely important, because this bears out where we came in on this argument, which is to say we are quite prepared to discuss common frameworks and how they operate, said that from the very beginning, but we're not prepared to have them imposed. So if any frameworks imposed, we won't cooperate. But now we are well into this process, 153 items, I think. I think that's gone down to 24, which are the core items. Work is continuing on those, but importantly, no Section 12 orders. So I think that has been an area where we've been able to prove that it is negotiation and discussion that will work, not imposition.
So, by all accounts, the Welsh Government are slightly more progressed with these compared to the Scottish Government in terms of setting up these common frameworks necessary.
No, I'm afraid that's not true.
And that comes after, the Welsh Government worked with the UK Government to secure changes to the withdrawal bill, which the Welsh Government ultimately backed. The Welsh Government proposed Welsh provisions for the agriculture bill so that the Welsh farmers have certainty after they leave the European Union, particularly around farm payments. Why is it, do you think, that Labour-run Wales are able to work constructively with the Conservative government here, and yet SNP-run Scotland seems totally incapable of reaching any sort of constructive working relationship with the UK government?
Well, as I just indicated, we have no Section 12 orders and we have two agreed periodic reports. That would seem, I think, even a severe critic would use the word constructive in those circumstances. I think I can't agree with the representation of the withdrawal bill. There was a difference of opinion as to what we should do. Mark Drake and I continue to work and have continued to work very closely together. David Lidington made it very clear and formally clear that there would be no differentiation drawn between the two countries as a result of that. So that rather I think gives the lie to any suggestion that Wales had got something that we didn't get, so we've moved forward on that basis. I think also a very really important issue in this is Scotland, your constituents, my constituents, voted against Brexit, unlike Wales. And in those circumstances, I think that is a key factor in our thinking and remains a key factor in our thinking.
But there is a distinction between those. I mean, I voted Remain as well, but I'm also a Democrat. Mm-hmm. My constituents, I think, are very similar to me in that the majority voted Remain, but they recognise that the result was different. And they don't think my job is to now try and stop Brexit at every opportunity, which appears to be the SNP positions, to ignore the referendum result in 2016, ignore the referendum result in 2014, try and stop Brexit, try and reopen the whole independence debate again. It's all about disruption and chaos for the SNP, isn't it, Mr. Russell?
Well, I can't say I'm terribly surprised by that representation, but for the record, I dispute it in every regard. The position I'm in at the present moment is this. I think that the people of Scotland were very clear to say that they didn't want to withdraw from the EU. I stood on a manifesto which said that this would be a material change in circumstances, and that is what has happened. For the last 2.5 years, I've worked very hard, repeatedly, with the UK government and with others, to try and get some sort of accommodation to those positions. And, I think a number of observers have impartial observers too, have made it pretty clear that what's happened is a refusal to compromise on the part of the Prime Minister. I mean, when I met the Prime Minister last with the First Minister to discuss what we thought we might be discussing, which was and indeed this is what was being said publicly, we would discuss compromise positions. What we actually heard was an explanation of why we simply weren't bright enough to understand how good her deal was. Obviously, she wasn't either, because her deal changed. In these circumstances, I'm quite happy to argue for an opportunity for the people of Scotland to say whether they accept the Brexit deal or they want something else. That could be a second referendum. I've publicly supported that, a second EU referendum, and continue to do so. What I'm not prepared to accept is that the people of Scotland have no say in the matter and are simply forced out of Europe against their will. That is a difference between us. It's a legitimate difference between us, and I suspect it will remain a difference between us.
Okay, thank you. Can I just ask on the common frameworks, and I know we've got other questions on this. There was update from the UK government in February, I believe, this year, where they talk about the progress and the ongoing and the policy teams that have been put in place to try and develop outline frameworks. What's your understanding of where we are with this now, and are we much further forward than developing some sort of approach and strategy towards common frameworks?
That was the second periodic report, which is within the agreement that these would be produced every 3 months. I think Ian Davison, who has been responsible for this in the Scottish Government, will be able to confirm that. And it reflects the position not just of the UK Government, but of the Scottish Government and the Welsh Government. And I pay very much tribute to Ian and his team. This has been exhaustive and exhausting work to ensure that once we'd boiled down the 153 to 24, we did our very best to ensure that there were working relationships. Now, there are some areas where that's been more difficult than others. Setting the principles under which we did that was quite a time-consuming basis. And, of course, there will be differences. The example of the agriculture bill raised by Mr. Lamont is an interesting example where the presence, and Christian Jarden's point is germane here, the presence of a Council of Ministers, Agricultural Council of Ministers, as in Europe, would resolve that issue, because there would be a mechanism to resolve that issue within that Council of Ministers. The present mechanism, unfortunately, is when you get to the stage of disagreement, it is either you do this or we'll just do what we want. That's not a good basis for a relationship.
In the first periodic review, there was little clarity about what these common frameworks would look like. The second one in February doesn't provide much more clarity at all about what will actually happen with this common. You've got a view about what they're eventually going to look like, or how they should look.
I'd be happy to write to you about this is a complex area. There are a number of stages that this is going through. We are moving into a stage, and I gave evidence to the Scottish Parliament's Finance and Constitution Committee, I think 3 weeks ago on this, and detailed this. We're now moving to the stage of involving stakeholders in certain of those frameworks discussions within the 24, so that they are engaged and brought into it. The Scottish Parliament's Finance and Constitution Committee, under the excellent convenership, Bruce Crawford, has been looking at this issue, held an event in the Royal Society in Edinburgh in early November about this, is going to report on it, and we've invited them to be part of the process of ensuring, as a cross-party committee, of ensuring engagement from stakeholders as we take this forward. So it is getting there. It is, as is usual in government, important work that is done in the background by officials. It is related to, but not exactly the same as, areas in which we've not been able to make progress, and one of them is on legislative consent, where we believe the system is broken and we want to operate a broken system.
Grateful. David Duckett.
Thank you very much. Going back to what you were saying earlier in response to Mr Lamont, Mr Lamont and I believe both voted Remain in the 2016 referendum and have since, I believe, agreed that we should be following through in the democratic will of the British people, as was the condition of that referendum. So with that in mind, do you accept that the 62% who are often quoted as having voted in Scotland for the United Kingdom to remain in the EU may have also changed their mind?
I accept that some of them may have been. I think the polling on this is quite interesting. There are a small number of people that have moved from Remain to Leave. There are a small number of people, a larger number of people actually, according to the polling, moved from Leave to Remain. But I actually think the issue here is whether you accept that Scotland has a right to be heard and has a right to say we're not going to be dragged out against our will. Now, we could rehearse this all day, and I'm sure you might like to, but we wouldn't in the end make any progress, you and I, in this, because we have a diametrically opposed view on it. I don't believe that Scottish democracy can be subverted in the way that is being suggested. I believe that Scottish democracy needs to be allowed to express itself. I have backed a second referendum for Europe. I am quite clear that I want the people of Scotland to have the chance to say whether they want Brexit to take place or not. We must agree to differ.
I think we will agree to differ on whether Scotland should be an independent country or not. But in terms of what numbers and statistics are used to represent what is an indicator of how the Scottish electorate would vote in such a referendum, do you also accept, as an indicator, the 56% of voters who voted in the 2017 general election for parties who were committed, at that point at least, in their manifestos to deliver on the result of Brexit?
What I would look at is a constantly changing set of results and issues. I might point out the opinion poll at the weekend, which showed that 53% of people in Scotland would vote for independence and 47% for Theresa May's deal, whatever that is. It's rather difficult to tell this morning. So I would point to an opinion poll published, I think, by the Mail today, and the Mail is not known for its fondness for the SNP, which shows a 19-point lead for the SNP in the Scottish Parliament elections. So I think one has to keep going with how opinion is. One needs to judge it. That's one of the problems in arguing against both an independence referendum and a second European referendum, that you just say that's it, over and done with, it's in aspic. That seems to be something dangerous to do. And I think I would want to go on reading the runes of what's taking place. And of course the ultimate rune to read is an election.
Well, as per the 2017 general election that we had, that I've just quoted the results on. But again, just finally on this line of questioning, you mentioned a second referendum that you'd be in favour of. Which second referendum?
I'd be in favour of giving the people of Scotland a right to choose on the issue of Brexit. Now, there's a number of ways of doing that. The first way to do it, the opportunity, I don't know what amendments are coming in front of you tonight. Your system is more complicated than ours, so I'd have to, you may not even know what amendments are coming before you tonight, but one of them may be on a second European referendum, and I think that would be worth supporting. Had I the honour to be a member of the House of Commons, I would be voting for that. But if that does not happen, then I think the people of Scotland continue to have a right to express a view as to whether they should be in a Brexit Britain or they should be an independent country, because that's the only option. There's another option. If there is another option, if the UK government or the opposition come up with an option, and this is germane to the area we're discussing, that says we can achieve equality between the nations, the four nations of these islands, and we can make that work, that's an option that people should be able to look at. At the present moment, it appears to me that the argument might boil down to whether you want to have Brexit Britain or whether you want to have an independent country. That seems to be a reasonable choice. But today...
But does that not actually, sorry to interrupt, but does that not actually represent two individual different second referendums, if you like? There would have to be a second referendum on Brexit and a second referendum on independence, or vice versa.
I think you have to wait and see how this pans out. First of all, is there going to be a referendum on the EU? And I wouldn't say anything until I knew that. That matter is in your hands tonight. Maybe, or next week, or next month.
Maybe just come off referendums and get back to where we should be, which is on common frameworks. And I'd just like to ask you, I mean, looking at the current GMC machinery and infrastructure that's in place just now, so do you think they could effectively establish and manage Brexit common frameworks? And if they can't, what alternative arrangements would you have in place?
Well, I think what the common frameworks thing shows is that with enough patience and goodwill, you can begin to make some progress, and that's what we should have seen, for example, with issues of withdrawal bill, forcing the withdrawal bill down the throats of the Scottish Parliament, and then taking it to the Supreme Court. Doesn't seem to me to show either patience or wisdom, and that's what actually happened. It suggests to me also that we need, at the very least, to go back to where we started in this, a new structure for the relationships between the governments of these islands. I have my own view of what that structure should be, but it should be.
We'll just give examples of things that we've heard in this committee. For example, the PACAC committee have put forward an independent secretariat, for example, to manage development and common frameworks. And we've had the example of, Professor Colin suggested a reporting and notice requirements to be part and a feature of the GMC. So, a lot of people have suggested other means to manage this common frameworks other than the existing GMC machinery. I just wondered what your views about some of the alternatives were.
I would only really support a new structure to manage it if I thought there was to be no change to the GMC structures at all, right? Because I don't think the GMC structures could manage it. But it doesn't seem to me the best thing to do to park the GMC structures on the grounds that they're so hopeless that they can't do something and then do something else. It would seem to be much more sensible to say, look, GMC structure, by universal acclaim, does not work. Academic study after academic study, committee after committee. I gave evidence to PACAC. I was surprised at the strength of the PACAC view on a variety of things. It doesn't work. So surely it should be changed in some way. You can be a radical in terms of change as I am, or you can be a conservative in terms of change, but surely people believe that change is needed. And if that change takes place, one of the elements should be how do you manage that relationship? Because the frameworks are simply the detail of the relationship between on subject areas between the governments. That's all it is. And that is the detail, the scaffolding that's around that. And that's how we should understand it.
Thank you. Hugh Gaffney.
Thanks, Chair. You've just said change is needed. On the public show, we see the Punch and Judy show every week between the SNP and the Conservative government. And that was highlighted last week at the question time when it was asked a question about who's got the mandate for Scotland. You said earlier on the UK is the sovereign body over Scottish Parliament. So what, in the background, take it away from the public eye, what discussions have you had about the compliance and common framework rules which will be monitored and enforced?
Well, we've had substantial discussion about how the common frameworks are reached, in other words, what the agreement would be. But the issue of what you would have in a dispute resolution mechanism has largely been avoided by trying to get the relationship to a stage where that would not be required. And I mean, I'm very straight about that. It would be better to have the relationship in which you weren't going to need those. Now, that already exists. An example I often use on this in terms of common frameworks aren't really new. There was an issue that arose at the very beginning of devolution over the Solway and the Border-esque, two rivers that are part of the border of Scotland and England. How were you going to have a framework that operated those rivers, navigation and fishing, more importantly, on those rivers? Now, the solution was a very elegant one. I don't know what civil servant thought it up, but it's elegant. Scotland administers the Solway, England administers the Border-esque, right? And actually, I've had people who've complained bitterly to me that they required a rod licence for the Border-esque because it was under English jurisdiction, and Solway was different. But actually, it was a neat solution. And if you're going to get this to work, you need to have some neat solutions in place. But governance, which is the point that the convener has made, is very important. And governance seems to me to require a structure which is better than the JMC. So if you're going to change what's happening and get things into a new relationship, then you're going to have to change the JMC structures. And that's, I go back to the Welsh Labour government's paper on this. I think it was a very good starting point. We, in our first Scotland's Place in Europe paper in December 2016, also outlined changes to devolution, which we thought would serve these purposes. The only people who haven't brought anything to this table are the UK government.
Well, on that basis of common agreement, could a single body deal with the agreement of common frameworks, monitoring the compliance and the common framework rules, or should these rules be split?
I think a revised structure of intergovernmental structure could do so. I think that, I'd rather see it done by international agreement, so we would agree it with the UK as two sovereign states. But if you're not talking about that on the basis of equality, then you need to have a structure that works. And that's a structure of equality which I could manage that. The corollary of that, I have to say, is the existing JMC structure could not do that.
Tommy Shepherd.
Just a supplementary on this about the mechanisms. You'll know that the Cabinet Office is having a review of intergovernmental relations, look at common frameworks, JMC, the MOU. When the Minister gave evidence to our committee, Minister Smith, she said that no timetable or end point had been set for this review, so it wasn't possible to tell us when we might see some fruit. Presumably you've been taking part in this. Would you like to see a timetable set? Do you have an expectation of where we're going with this?
I'd like to see a start point set. I mean, I don't think it's virtually started yet. There's an awful lot of official contact, but I have seen no, as you say, fruit. I haven't even seen, a green shoot as yet, let alone fruit. I have said repeatedly to David Lidington, I'm happy to say it here because I've written letters about it which have been released. This is a matter of urgency, but the particular urgency in this is this. We are not operating a legislative consent process presently for Brexit bills, and won't do so. We've done it on one occasion for the health access to the health bill, which was an issue of whether people in other UK citizens in other countries would have access to health, and we all thought that was an important issue to make an exception on. But we're not doing it. I have made proposals about how the legislative consent process could work. I made those, I certainly before the summer, certainly in the summer. Nothing has happened at all. There's a long grass review of the intergovernmental structures. It hasn't, in my view, produced anything. I've seen nothing from it. So in those circumstances, I would want a sense of urgency to apply. There is no urgency. I think we could resolve the issue of the legislative consent process quite quickly. Whether we could resolve the issue of intergovernmental relations, I don't know. But, given that every single report into this, academic or parliamentary, from whatever source, has indicated the structure doesn't work, I would have thought, you don't have to start from that. You have to start from saying, what solutions are people proposing? Could we make them work? But there's that big barrier. And the big barrier is parliamentary sovereignty.
Just to be clear on this then, you're telling us that to all intents and purposes, from where you sit, there isn't really an active review going on. There are, in the sense of, there being a schedule of meetings, there being an agenda, there being milestones.
I'm unaware of them. I know officials meet, and I know officials are working hard on our part, and I'm sure officials are working hard on the UK government's part. I have seen no fruits, and I'm certainly not aware of any impending recommendations of any description.
Okay.
And certainly there is no timetable.
David Duckett.
Thank you, Chair. Right, so taking Brexit out of the equation, just for briefly, and independence, let's not go there again. Do you think the Joint Ministerial Committee forum can at least, or should be, a productive forum for intergovernmental relations? And if so, what would you say its main achievements have been so far? And if not, what reforms or alternative approaches do you think would be appropriate?
Well, I mean, I'm not going to talk about achievements because I think they've been very limited. I mean, we've kept talking through the difficulties of Brexit. Sorry to mention the word. I'll try not to. We've kept talking, and that's an achievement. And every time I leave one of those meetings, I'm doorstepped by journalists at least one of whom is in this room, and every time I have to say, well, we're doing our best, we're continuing to talk, and we will continue to talk. I think it's far better to do that. But let's take independence aside, and I think that's the best solution. I do think it is possible to imagine a better set of relationships, but they have to be, first of all, based on principles, and that's, of course, where we started on frameworks with Damien Green. We drew up the principles that would govern it, and then we said, how do we put those principles into practice? I think the basic principle is equality amongst the partners, and I think you then say, how do we construct a structure that works? Again, I commend the Welsh work on this. I think it's taken us on. There's a lot of academic work on this. Actually, it wouldn't be difficult to do. It wouldn't be difficult to revise the JMC structure, put it on a statutory footing, make sure that there was some sort of dispute resolution procedure that was fair and recognised as fair, and that the committee's structures and remits were clearly understood. And that would get a big step forward.
So on that principle of having 4 equal nations being represented equally, do you think there's scope, or there should be scope for England to be represented specifically?
Well, I'm going to be very careful about getting involved in that argument. I may have been born in that nationalist hotbed Bromley, but I'm not going to be partial in this matter. I think it is important that there's a recognition between the difference, and I make this point seriously, Mr. Duguid, it's not an innocent political point. There's a difference between representing the United Kingdom and reserved matters in the United Kingdom and representing matters which are matters devolved to the other nations but are English specific, right? And I think that distinction needs to be drawn. Agriculture is a good example of it, but there are some areas in which there is virtually no overlap. When I was Education Secretary for 5 years, much of that time Michael Gove was Education Secretary. We had amiable conversations most of the time, but there was no real need for us to work together because the two systems were distinct, completely distinct. Wales had a different issue. Wales and Northern Ireland operate the system of A-levels. We don't. So we might meet occasionally, but there was no great tension in that. There are other issues where there is considerable overlap. And recognising that through a structure of equality would be not difficult, in my view.
Isn't that the heart of the matter, though? Like when you have got a JMC structure which involves the UK and the devolved institutions, that the UK also speaks for England. And surely that, and given that England is the vast majority of the population of the United Kingdom, surely that is just as an arithmetical proposition is something that's obviously going to be with inbuilt problems.
Yes, and if you put into that mix the concept of Westminster parliamentary sovereignty, you've got a real set of issues to address. But you should, I think in the second decade of the 21st century, you should do it on the basis of equality between the nations of these islands. Now, whether that can be achieved within the current constitutional framework, I doubt. But that's what the principle should be.
I'm just looking back at some of the comments about GMC, and you obviously referenced some of the other inquiries and reports that have been produced. The Centre on Constitutional Change, for example, like it is said that perceived by the devolved governments as being determined by the priorities and interests of the UK government. And we talked about the achievements, and we asked specifically the minister responsible in the UK government last week, Chloe Smith, because she was unable to provide an example of a positive outcome of the JMC. She talked about racking her brains to try and find an example, but she couldn't give one. I know you've been gentle about all of this. This just doesn't work, does it? And we really need to sort of look at how we design a proper means of effectively coordinating activities of all the parliaments and assemblies across the UK.
If we could, and there were people in this room who will find this a surprising thought and will think that I'm being disingenuous, but I'll try. If we could just take this away from the day-to-day battle between the parties, Mr. Gaffney was representing First Minister's question in a certain way, and say, accepting the differences, accepting that if we are all agreed, and we may not be all agreed, but if we're all agreed on the principle of equality, how would we make that work? And how would we change the structure to do so? That would be the question. And I don't think it is beyond the wit of all of us to put that in place, particularly 20 years after devolution. Everybody accepts this does not work.
Thank you. Christine Jordan.
Thank you very much. The UK government's commitment last summer to holding JMC European negotiations meetings on a monthly basis, did that improve the effectiveness of joint working on Brexit?
Well, it actually hasn't happened. I think that's the issue. There was an original commitment when the JMC-EN was set up in October, that in October 16, that it would meet every month. Mm-hmm. Met in November, December, January, I think February, and then not again till October. Then there was a commitment that, and to be fair, Damien Green largely honoured this, to have more regular meetings, and that improved things a bit. Then they began to tail off again. Now, there have been reasons for that. For example, there were 2 within a week in November because of the deal that was brought back. Although the first was completely irrelevant because the deal was back and being discussed in Downing Street. We weren't allowed to talk about it because we weren't told anything about it. And some of the way in which the committee operates just doesn't really ring particularly true. I don't think it's frequency of meetings. I think it's structure of meetings. I think it's a question of equity. There was meant to be last October a commitment for them to be the meetings to revolve around the country. Mm-hmm. The revolution was meant to be 1 in Edinburgh, 1 in Cardiff, and 4 in London, which is slightly, the orbit is a little bit skewed there, but we agreed to it. We haven't met in Edinburgh or Cardiff. That hasn't happened. Now, the JMC plenary has only met once outside London. Met in Cardiff in January 2017, end of January 2017. And these meetings are always chaired by the UK. Always chaired by the UK. So there's lots of just even small things in there you can say, could we change how we do things? But the big thing is the role and function and how the countries relate to each other.
Would an independent secretariat for the JMC and an agenda agreed in advance, for example, by all 4 governments, would that help?
No, I think that is a technical issue which might improve the functioning of each meeting. It doesn't address the weakness of the structure. Mm-hmm. The weakness of the structure is based upon there being an ability to overrule no matter what happens, and this issue of dancing around Westminster sovereignty. The issue to be addressed is, can you put together a relationship of equity? I used the phrase earlier, I know you know it. Can you do it on the sort of basis of European Council of Ministers? Could you do it in that sort of way? Could you have the Welsh paper, for example, goes into some details on qualified majority voting? I'm not saying I would endorse that, but there are ways of resolving issues, which are around. I think that's what's needed, not just. There's a sort of independent secretariat in the sense that the officials, there's a JMCO, which is the officials part of it, and they do spend a lot of time talking to each other. Sorry.
No, I was going to ask, what would you say to the comment or the criticism that perhaps some people in Scotland who are as opposed to independence as you are committed to independence are concerned that any suggestion of changing the JMC or changing the relationship is what they would call mission creep and gradual independence, so that it's done without having to have the will of the Scottish people expressed in an election or referendum?
Well, I don't think, 2 parts that I don't believe independence could be delivered without an expression of will. But the other one is a natural fear from people who hold that view. I've tried to, and people may or may not believe this, but over the last 2.5 years, I've tried, and with the support of the First Minister and my colleagues in government, to be constructive and straightforward in what we're trying to achieve, and that's what we will continue to do. I've made it clear every time I've talked about this issue to committees here or in the Scottish Parliament that I don't resile from my support for independence, but I don't think the way we're doing things at the present moment is an effective or efficient way of doing things, and we could find a lot better way. Whether or not some people from the other side of the argument might say that I was then compromising in a way that would make independence harder to achieve. Depends what criticism you're prepared to take.
Okay. On going back to the GMC specifically, though, its current dispute resolution, do you think it's fit for purpose?
No, I mean, absolutely not. I mean, and if you doubted it, look, for example, at the complaint that the Welsh Government made about money for Northern Ireland, and the lack of barnetisation of that money. The complaint was made with a dispute resolution mechanism, and the judge and jury of allowing the complaint to move forward, let alone adjudicating on it, was the UK government, which had given the money, which said, no, nothing to see here, move along. There is no reason to consider this as a complaint. It's farcical. I mean, and that's why it's not used, because there's no point in using it.
So do you think a proper independent dispute resolution mechanism for to work with both the UK and the Scottish governments would have helped in the discussions of Brexit frameworks if we had a proper independent dispute resolution mechanism, perhaps even to replace the Sewell Convention? Would that work better?
It would be considerably better than what exists now. I'm very struck by something, and having some time, that the Taoiseach said, I think at the last but one British Irish Council, when talking at the press conference afterwards about trust and relationships. He said, the reason that the EU works is not just because the 27 members, number 28, trust each other. It is because that trust is underpinned by a formal process of law. So, I trust you, but actually if we don't get on, there's a means by which we can resolve it.
Yes.
There is no such means in the JMC. In fact, the reverse is true, because they simply say, no, I'm sorry, we can't accept that complaint and we're not allowing it to happen. So if you accept the Taoiseach's analysis, which I think is a very good one, then I think that you have to apply it here.
So would I be fair if I were to summarise that your position, you would say that the view that there needs to be an improvement in the relationship and the workings of the JMC is not necessarily linked to independence, but is simply a view that it should work better for us all at the moment?
If you would allow me to phrase it in a slightly different way, it would be a matter of emphasis rather than anything else. I believe that the aim should be to have a good functioning relationship. I believe the best way to do that is to have independence, but if that were not to happen, short, medium or long term, if that were not to happen, then it would be incumbent upon all of us, and is incumbent upon all of us, not to allow this failed system to continue. We should find a better way of doing it.
Thank you.
If we were to have...
Shoot off to
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. If we were to have an independent dispute system, who would oversee it and who would make the judgments?
Well, I think that is the matter for negotiation. It's not as difficult as it seems. I mean, you could, other countries allow courts to have that role. I mean, that's a possibility.
The Supreme Court?
Well, could be. I mean, we've been there before. I feel quite warmly towards the Supreme Court these days, I have to say, given my experience in recent months. I think more likely is to try and work on some of the ideas, for example, that the Welsh have brought up. I mean, I think they're a bit complex in places, but it's not impossible to do so. The impossibility is to do so if you accept that one part of that structure is sovereign and cannot be gainsaid. That makes it impossible. You can't have an independent process of any description. If you accept that is not the case, that there are 4 equal partners in the room trying to come to a resolution, I think that's not difficult to do.
Okay, thank you. Did you rock it? It's you're on anyway.
Yes, indeed. In fact, you asked the question I was going to ask the Cabinet Secretary anyway, but I wanted to ask about how well the two governments, you've touched on this a little bit, how well the two governments share information about policies and bills. I'm thinking most recent example of where that seems to have fallen down a little bit is the Stronger Towns Fund announcement, which was made last week by the UK government. As I understand it, the Scottish government wasn't informed of that, and I think still hasn't been informed, you might be able to correct me on that, as to how much money might come Scotland's way on the back of it. So I was just wondering if you could perhaps tell us a little bit more about how those relationships work, because it does seem to have got a little more intense, if you like, over the last year or so.
If you look back over devolution, the relationship between officials has always been crucial in making sure there was a flow of information. politics has ebbed and flowed. You know, I'm told by some civil servants, Mr. Gaffney might not like this very much, but I'm told by some civil servants the relationship when Labour was in power in Edinburgh and in power in London, the relationship wasn't actually very good because they were simply, in fact, being told what to do. Our relationship wasn't that great with Gordon Brown's government, but that was because, to be blunt, I think Gordon Brown simply didn't want the Scottish government to be seen to be doing anything that would be praiseworthy. Actually, the Cameron period was probably the easiest period of all, because I think there was once the Edinburgh Agreement was in place, there was a recognition that it was a formal structure and things were moving a certain way. And then it has fallen off pretty badly. I mean, partly, I must be honest about this, the Prime Minister, is not a person who seems willing to listen to what devolved administrations want to say, still less to compromise as a result of that. So you've got those difficulties in place, so there's politics in it. The official relationship tended to keep positive, but has suffered greatly under Brexit. And it suffered really, I suspect, because of the pressure on the civil service here, as much as anything else. There has been moderately good exchange of information on the issue of EU exit and no deal exit, but frankly I just think because they need to make sure that Scotland is able to deliver in certain areas which they can't, and that I recognise that, and we agreed that we would try and compartmentalise that and see how we could work together. I just think that in terms of normal discourse on announcements, it's very poor. There was a convention that bills were shared and discussed. That broke down pretty quickly in Brexit because the withdrawal bill was only shown to us, I think, 2 weeks before it was published. And there were major problems with it that we couldn't accept. A bill of that nature that would require legislative consent would actually have been shared over a long period of time. That simply did not happen. I mean, I asked to see the draft of the bill, or drafts of the bill, and the timetable. Certainly I asked at the GMC plenary of the Prime Minister in January 2017. We didn't see it until, I think, early July 2017, which was very considerable problems. I acknowledge our own position in that. As a result of that, we have not shared some things which they might have expected. All I say was I think that's a practice that we've grown shy of each other in doing so. If a bill requires legislative consent, it's better that it is agreed as much as possible beforehand. I have to say that Suella Braverman, when she was in DEXU, was very positive in trying to share parts of the withdrawal implementation bill. I don't think that has continued, but that bill, needs to be resolved. I mean, in the light of what happens today, that bill will become pretty crucial if things go a certain way. And, there is no prospect of us giving it, or recommending to give it legislative consent. But, it would be quite useful to know where these matters were.
And certainly the Cabinet Secretary, Fergus Ewing, had expressed similar concerns over his issues with the agriculture bill and the fisheries bills as well.
And there's been a range of problems.
I'm interested in your comment when you said about sharing information. What we got from Professor Nicola McEwen when she was in front of this committee says that there's a fear of sharing information now from the UK government because of the strained relationships, particularly over Brexit. I don't know if that's something.
I used to worry about that. In fact, it was just us until I discovered that UK cabinet ministers were being taken into rooms and supervised when they were reading documents. So I think the fear of showing people things extends not simply to the Scottish government, but there is a reluctance to share.
I think it will shock everybody. One of your opening remarks today, when you said that there was nothing shared with the Scottish government, like in advance of the statement to the House of Commons last evening. I'm presuming that something's now been shared with the Scottish Government in advance of the debate today, but are we at this stage where one of the most critical votes in the House of Commons is just about to be made and the UK Government are not in a position to be able to share some of that information?
Nothing as yet, but I haven't been in Edinburgh, I've been here, so something may have happened, but as of this morning, nothing had been shared.
Would you support something which suggested some sort of formal exercise then when statements to the House of Commons are being made on critical issues which impact on the responsibilities of the Scottish Government, that should automatically be shared with devolved administrations?
Well, I think the courtesy would be, as those statements were being considered, there was a discussion and understanding of what their impact would be. But that would, you'd have to, go back to the point I made about trust, you would have to get yourself to the stage where there was trust in how this would work. And there is no trust presently in how this would work. So it's not going to happen overnight.
Okay, Christine Charlton.
Thank you very much. Just one concern I have is that perhaps we need to be very careful that the debate doesn't just become about how bad the UK government is and that all the fault is on one side. Do you think that we should perhaps remain open to the possibility that there are things that the Scottish Government could do to improve the relationship?
I'm always open to possibilities. I suspect you are open to that possibility. Maybe I'm not quite as open, but I'm quite happy to consider if there are issues. There will be issues. The UK government will say, well, every time they come to a meeting, they just moan. I mean, I am conscious of the fact, no secret, Mark Dreyfus and I have talked about it often enough. There's nothing particularly pleasant coming to a meeting in London and sitting there and moaning about things. I mean, I'm generally of quite a happy disposition, and can be very constructive. So there may be those views, but at the end of the day, the whip hand in this lies with the UK government, not with the devolved administrations. So unless that changes, not much is going to change.
I think I know none of our Conservative colleagues are with us any longer, but I think one of them raised the issue last week that the Scottish Government didn't share its continuity bill with the UK Government in advances. Was that the case?
Yeah, I freely admit it, that we haven't shared, and I would see that as a reaction to where we are, but others might take that amiss and say, you should have shared it. I mean, as it happened, I think the issue is not sharing the continuity bill, the issue is taking it to the Supreme Court, which doesn't seem to me to have been a particularly friendly action, but
Thank you. Hugh Gaffney.
Yeah, talked a lot about shared information, and you said earlier we agreed beforehand. So 92 million was given to the Scottish Government in the Barnett consequentials. Has all the money been handed to the local authorities who will be dealing with the majority of this money? Or how much has been handed down?
I don't think I'd accept the analysis that all the money should be handed to the local authorities. I mean, that perforce wouldn't be correct. I've had discussions with COSLA about how this should happen. Indeed, I had a conversation yesterday with the Chief Executive of my own local authority in Argyll and Bute about these issues. We've made it clear that we will want to make sure if there was a no deal that they were not disadvantaged insofar as we could. We have spent a proportion, I couldn't tell you exactly which, but I'm happy to outline to the committee, of the sums that we've received. I think it's somewhat less than has been indicated there. But we are happy to say we're applying those funds in every way we possibly can. We will be out of pocket no matter what happens.
Thank you. Jed Killen.
Thank you, Chair. Cabinet Secretary, we've had a lot of evidence about the level of awareness of devolution in government departments. Do you think that civil servants in Whitehall have enough knowledge and understanding of the devolution settlement?
No, but it's not a criticism so much as an expression almost of inevitability. So in 20 years since devolution, if you were a civil servant in the run-up to devolution 95, 96, 97, 99, the odds are many will have retired, or there won't be many left to remember that. And some departments wouldn't be involved in it anyway. If you're in the Foreign Office, you probably wouldn't think much about devolution because it hasn't impinged upon how you do your job. And if you're in, very few civil servants stay in a job for 5, let alone 20 years. If you were in a department much affected by devolution, time has gone on. You're operating in a different way. You're no longer concerned about Scotland. So I think almost inevitably, things have moved on. I think there are issues about sensitivity and an expectation that because you have responsibility for a subject in England and Wales, you're automatically responsible for it elsewhere. Or there are elements that you need to understand are somebody else's responsibility. And I know there is a awareness training, but I'm not sure it really gets very far. I think there's also an issue about the civil service. I may be wrong about this, but I think when Philip Rykoff retires at the end of this month, he will be the last senior civil servant who has also worked in the Scottish Government. Now, the idea of having a single civil service was, at least in part, to have an exchange. I think that fiction is probably dead now. Just as a separate civil service in Northern Ireland, I think moving to a stage of a separate civil service in Scotland, that paradoxically might be helpful, because people would then recognise what their responsibilities are and be aware of other people's responsibilities.
Is it not still important, though, that the civil service has at least a knowledge and an understanding, because there could be all kinds of implications for Scotland in day-to-day decisions that are being taken? And in that light, what is the Scottish Government doing to try and build, if anything, to try and build capacity in the UK civil service for understanding devolution?
We can't build capacity in the UK civil service. I mean, what we can do is make it clear where we think there are issues that need to be addressed. I mean, here's the issue of Mr Shepherd was raising of the intergovernmental review. That's a crucial issue, and it needs to be addressed by the UK government politically. But there is an officials part of that which also needs to be sensitised to it. I mean, I think there is an inevitability after 20 years of not as much live understanding of what devolution is than there would be 20 years before. But I don't think the Scottish Government can do much about that. The Scottish Government carries on and does its business.
Well, from the other angle then, is the Scottish Government doing anything to try and build awareness within the civil service, its civil servants and their knowledge of Whitehall departments?
Yes, I mean, our civil servants, to tell you honest, true, spend a lot of time, our senior civil servants, here. Mine do. I spend, of course, a lot of time here too, but my officials do that and are regular touch. And actually, as I indicated in answer to another question, it is that good relationship that has tended to oil the wheels, and it's when that relationship deteriorated, I think largely because of pressure on the UK civil service as a result of Brexit, that there has been a deterioration in the relationship.
Thank you. Christine Charlie.
Thank you very much. I should declare or state up front that, like others in this room, I have worked directly with the UK civil service in many departments when I was a special advisor. And while I accept that there will not be many still working who remember the process of the creation of a devolved parliament, surely the point is that a civil servant knows their department's responsibilities and they know their minister's responsibilities, and those departments which are reserved know they are reserved, and those departments which have devolved responsibilities, they know they have devolved responsibilities. And it doesn't actually matter, I wouldn't have thought, that they were around in 1997, because you can make the same criticism not just of the civil servants in Scotland, but of a great many of the politicians. There's no great need for us all to have been around in 1997 to know what the state of play is today, and surely that is the dictating factor in the relationship. The way it is today, and as long as, I don't think for a minute civil servants in either Scotland or at Westminster are unaware of their job and what their task is, and to suggest that they should have been around 20 years ago to have an understanding of the job they do today is a little unfair on them.
Well, it would be if I'd suggested that, but as I didn't suggest that, then I absolved myself from the accusation of unfairness. The point I was making is that I think I used the word, actually, inevitable. It would be inevitable that there would be a deterioration because people weren't as sensitised to it. But I think I'd also dispute the issue of people knowing responsibilities. I mean, it is pretty inconceivable to me, but we have had to deal in recent months with documents issued by the UK government which didn't recognise that there was a separate Scottish legal system. And that's pretty incredible to me, but that's actually true. So I think in those circumstances, I'm not blaming individual civil servants. I'm saying, however, I think that the complexities of devolution doesn't necessarily always ring bells now.
Thank you. Hugh Gaffney.
If we're not going to blame the people, what about the departments? Would the requirement for Whitehall departments to produce devolution impact assessments for new policies, would that help improve joint working?
Well, it might do. I think the issue is where there are areas that overlap, then I think everybody should be sensitised to it and should be aware of it. So if that helped, fine. I'm always slightly reluctant to add to people's workload, and if the more people have forms to fill in, sometimes the more those forms just look the same, So I think I would want to see a greater sensitivity and a greater clarity. There is, forgive me for saying this, but there's a clarity in the fact that if there was an independent Scotland that ran its affairs, an independent England ran its affairs, we would be very clear about what the relationship was. Now, if we can operate on the basis of equality, then that also clarifies things. What makes things confusing is that lack of clarity and the addition of the concept of Westminster sovereignty.
Thank you. Deidre Brock.
Cabinet Secretary, you mentioned a programme that existed for the civil service, and I wondered, you're aware of the One Civil Service programme, launched by Jeremy Hayward in Edinburgh in 2015. I wondered about your thoughts on that and whether that helps to improve.
Very much of it since then. I'm happy to get you. This is one of those occasions where, I really do need an official next to me to say this is how it's worked in the civil service. I'm happy to provide that answer to you. I'll ask the Permanent Secretary to tell you where that is.
Okay, great. The Minister actually from last week said she'd provide us with information from her end, although she wasn't quite clear about what that might consist of. So between the two of you, I think it would be an interesting answer. Thank you.
Let's take advantage of having the Cabinet Secretary for Government Business and Constitutional Relations in front of us today. What's obviously going to be a very dramatic day. And I think the expectation is still that the government will be defeated in the withdrawal agreement when presented at 7 o'clock this evening. And beyond that, there might be some short extension as yet unspecified and defined. What will the Scottish Government do in response to these expected turn of events?
Well, our position remains clear. We feel, if there was to be if there's an approval of our deal tonight, that would be very bad for Scotland. It's a very bad deal, particularly bad for Scotland in terms of freedom of movement, in terms of competitive disadvantage, ignoring the will of the Scottish people. So that is a bad deal. If were that deal to be approved for a variety of reasons, then we would make it absolutely clear how difficult that was, and we would act accordingly. If the deal is not, then we are of the view that there should be a ruling out of no deal. That would be, I've spent an awful lot of my time in the last 3 months on the issue of no deal, 3 or 4 months. I really do think that people need to get wise to how bad that would be, and it would be very, very bad. And then to get an extension in a period of time to do something constructive. And the most constructive thing you could have is to have a people's vote, and that would be what I would support.
Would you be expected to be properly consulted and sit around the table to discuss these next steps, or would that be a bit too much to expect?
I think the word expect overemphasises. I would hope that we might not have a rerun of what we saw in January, which is, telling people things under the guise of consultation. And you could go much further back on this. One of the reasons that we are in this, if I may use the phrase that I use in Scottish Parliament, cluster burach, one of the reasons that we are in that mess is because of the failure at the very beginning to bring into the room the First Ministers of Scotland and Wales, the leader of the Labour Party, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, and to sit down at the Greens, and Plaid Cymru, and sit down and say, how can we find a way forward, given the different positions? That actually has led us to this absolute chaos that we're in.
Grateful. Well, Minister, thank you ever so much for that. That's really helpful. I think there was a couple of things, I'm sure your officials were taking note of the further correspondence you will give to this committee about this, not just concludes the session, but this evidence inquiry. So we will be preparing a report too, and we'll make sure that you are able to see it. But thank you for coming down.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for attendance. Order.